History of commerce. In the year 1788 in France, a man was hanged for possessing half a kilo of salt that he had gathered himself from the seashore. He was not a criminal. He had not robbed or assaulted anyone. His only crime was taking something that nature placed at his disposal for free. That same year, thousands of people throughout France were being tried, imprisoned, or executed for the same reason. And when the masses finally lost their patience and took to the streets the following year, when the revolution began that would change the world forever, one of the fuels that lit that bonfire was salt. This is the oldest mineral that human beings have controlled, charged for, stolen, worshipped, and transformed into a political weapon. Salt dominated entire civilizations for thousands of years, built empires, financed armies, unleashed revolutions, and enslaved peoples, and today it is in your kitchen. So cheap and so ignored that no one stops to think about the history of horror and power that it carries inside each white grain. The history of salt begins long before the history of any nation. It begins with biology. The human body needs sodium to survive. Without it, muscles do not contract. Nerves do not transmit signals. The heart does not beat normally. Animals know this instinctively, which is why they seek out so-called salt licks, natural areas where the soil concentrates minerals, and there they gather in herds to lick the earth. The first humans did exactly the same. They followed the animals to those salty areas, ate raw meat that still retained its natural sodium, and did not need to actively search for salt. The problem came when humans began to cook food, to boil meat, to cultivate cereals and vegetables. That process eliminated the sodium from the food or diluted it until it became insufficient. Suddenly, the body asked for something that the diet no longer provided naturally, and there began the 10,000-year obsession with this mineral. The Chinese were the first to document its use systematically. The historical records of ancient China mention the extraction of salt approximately 4,700 years ago, during the reign of Emperor Huangdi. The chronicles of the time describe how the inhabitants of the coastal regions learned to evaporate seawater to collect the crystals that remained at the bottom of the containers. But more importantly, the texts of the period reveal something that would define the relationship between human beings and salt for entire millennia. The state intervened immediately. Salt production in China was never a private matter. From the most remote times on record, Chinese rulers understood that whoever controlled salt controlled everything else, because salt was the only thing that everyone needed without exception. The poor and the rich, the warrior and the farmer, the monk and the merchant, all needed salt to survive. And if the state was the only one that could provide it, the state had absolute power over every stomach in the kingdom. The Han Dynasty, which ruled China between the year 206 before Christ and 220 of our era, took that control to an unprecedented level of sophistication. They created the first state monopoly on salt in documented history. The government fixed prices, designated authorized producers, established the routes by which salt could be transported, and punished with death anyone who tried to bypass the system. The revenue generated by that monopoly financed the armies that expanded the empire, the public works that connected it, and the bureaucracy that administered it. The Great Wall of China was largely paid for with salt money. Salt was not a condiment. It was the financial backbone of the most populated civilization in the world. But knowledge about salt did not emerge solely in Asia. Thousands of kilometers away in Central Europe, in what is today the territory of Austria, there existed more than 3,000 years ago a region that would call itself by a name that in the Celtic language meant exactly that: the place of salt, Hallstatt. The salt mines of Hallstatt are the oldest in the world, with continuously documented mining activity Archaeologists found in those mines tools, clothing, corpses perfectly preserved by salt for millennia, and evidence of an economy so prosperous and so organized that historians named an entire era of European civilization in honor of that place, the Hallstatt culture, a civilization that flourished between the year 800 and 400 before Christ, based almost entirely on the extraction and trade of salt. The inhabitants of Hallstatt traded with the entire known world. Their roots reached the Mediterranean, the shores of the Baltic, and the steppes of Central Asia, and what they carried in their carts, what they exchanged for precious metals, for fabrics, for slaves, was salt. Pure rock salt, extracted from the bowels of the mountains. That same dynamic was repeated in the Mediterranean, with a power that would leave its mark on the language we speak today. The Roman Empire understood the power of salt and built one of its first major roads to transport it from the coast to the interior, the Via Salaria. The Salt Road started from the port of Ostia, where the water of the Mediterranean was evaporated in large ponds, and reached the inland regions where salt was scarce and valuable. That route was centuries old when Rome began to become an empire, and the name Rome gave to that road survived for more than 2,000 years in the geography of Italy, not in the geography of water, nor of wine, nor of wheat, but in that of salt. But what Rome did with salt, which transcends any road or any mine, is something that we still pronounce every time we receive our salary at the end of the month. Roman soldiers, who were the main instrument of the empire's power, received part of their compensation in salt or in money, specifically intended to buy salt. That payment was called in Latin salarium, and from salarium comes the word salary. Every time someone talks about their salary, their pay, their income, they are pronouncing without knowing it a word that was born from the salt that was given to a Roman legionary 2,000 years ago, so that he could preserve his food during the long marches across hostile territories. Salt not only financed civilizations, it embedded itself in the very language of the West. The Romans also understood something that their predecessors had intuited, but never formulated with such clarity. Salt not only preserved meat, it preserved power. When Rome conquered a territory, one of the first things it did was to ensure control of the salt sources in that region. Not on a whim, but out of pure logic. A people who cannot salt their food cannot store food. And a people who cannot store food cannot survive the winter without depending on someone, and that someone was always Rome. Dependence on salt was political dependence. Roman generals knew this perfectly well, and sometimes, as an extreme reprisal against cities that had rebelled with special violence, they would raze the fields, destroy the wells, and cut off access to salt. It was not necessary to burn every building. It was enough to interrupt the supply of that white mineral for the resistance to surrender in weeks. The Egyptians, for their part, had developed a relationship with salt that went beyond politics and economics. For them, salt was sacred because it did something that no other known material could do. Stop decomposition. The priests and embalmers of ancient Egypt had discovered that when a body was covered with a salt-rich compound called natron, the decomposition processes stopped. The flesh dried out. The tissues were preserved. And what remained could be kept recognizable for centuries, even millennia. That ability was for the Egyptians direct evidence of divine power. Salt not only preserved meat, it preserved the soul inside the body for the journey to the afterlife. The mummies that are exhibited today in museums around the world, the pharaohs and queens who have survived 3,000 years and that we can see with our own eyes, exist because someone, millennia ago, understood the power of salt and applied it with a precision that remains astonishing. That sacred dimension of salt was not exclusive to Egypt. In almost all ancient cultures of the Mediterranean and the Near East, salt appears as a ritual element of primary importance. The Greeks used it in sacrifices to their gods. The Romans mixed it with sacred flour for religious ceremonies. The biblical text itself mentions salt in dozens of passages, always associated with purity, covenant, and permanence. The Book of Numbers ordered that all sacrifices be offered with salt. The prophet Elisha purified the waters of a corrupted city by throwing salt into its spring, and Jesus of Nazareth compared his disciples to the salt of the earth, a compliment that his listeners understood perfectly because they knew that salt was the most valuable and the most essential thing that existed. Salt was sacred because it was indispensable, and it was indispensable because without it, civilization itself would crumble. When the ancient world began to fragment and the great empires of antiquity gave way to medieval civilizations, salt did not lose an ounce of its importance. On the contrary, in the Middle Ages, in a world without refrigeration, without chemical preservatives, without supermarkets or cold chains, salt was literally the difference between surviving the winter and starving to death. A peasant who had no salt could not preserve the meat of the pig he killed in autumn. He could not salt the fish he caught in summer. He could not preserve cheeses or pickled vegetables. Without salt, everything rotted. And everything that rotted in August meant hunger in January. That is why medieval saltworks were facilities as important and as heavily guarded as castles. That is why the feudal lords who controlled the salt sources were immensely more powerful than those who simply had fertile lands. Land without salt produced perishable food. Salt turned that food into stored power. Venice understood this before anyone else in Western Europe and turned it into the base of a commercial empire that would last for centuries. The city that we admire today as a tourist jewel on the lagoons of the Adriatic began as a concentration of swampy islands inhabited by refugees fleeing the barbarian invasions. They had no arable land. They had no forests for wood. They had no metals or precious stones. They had salt water and enough capacity to evaporate it. And with that, they built one of the richest states in history. Venetian merchants used salt as a currency of exchange throughout the Mediterranean. They bought spices from the east and paid for them with salt. They bought wood from the north and paid for it with salt. And when other states needed salt, they went to Venice. In the 11th century, Venice signed commercial treaties with entire cities in Italy, in which the main condition was simple. They bought their salt exclusively from Venice, at the prices Venice set, or Venice cut off their supply. It was a monopoly so ruthless that historians compare it to modern cartels. The difference is that Venice did it with a mineral that its clients needed in order not to die, not with a luxury good that they could reject. The heart of that medieval European salt trade beat in a place that today almost no one associates with this mineral. In northern Germany and the Scandinavian countries, where winters were brutal and animal protein was the difference between surviving and not surviving, salt was as critical as iron or wood. The Hanseatic League, the network of commercial cities that dominated the trade of northern Europe between the 11th and 10th centuries, built a large part of its power on the trade of salted herring. In the coastal cities of the Baltic, millions of herring were caught every year, but fresh herring rotted in hours. Salted herring could be transported for weeks and feed entire cities in the interior of Europe. The salt needed to salt that herring came mainly from the saltworks of Lüneburg in northern Germany, where salt was extracted by pumping groundwater over salt deposits and then evaporating the water. Those saltworks worked non-stop for centuries. The heat they needed to evaporate the water deforested entire regions of northern Germany, and the money they generated financed the expansion of cities like Hamburg, Lübeck, and Bremen, which are today first-rate economic centers. Baltic salt built northern Europe as much as stone and wood. But if there was a place in Europe where the salt mine surpassed everything that existed in the world. That place was in Poland, about 15 kilometers south of Krakow. In a small town called Wieliczka, there is a salt mine that began operating in the 11th century and continued producing salt uninterruptedly for 700 years. The Wieliczka mine is not simply a mine. It is an underground city that extends for more than 300 kilometers of galleries excavated in pure salt, with chapels, statues, chandeliers, and even an underground lake, all carved in salt by the miners. Over the centuries, the kings of Poland depended so directly on the income from that mine that they had a saying, "Whoever controls Wieliczka controls Poland." And that was literally true. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the Wieliczka mine generated between a third and a half of the total income of the Polish crown. No other source of wealth in the kingdom came close to it. When the kings of Poland wanted to finance wars, pay mercenaries, or buy alliances, they sold salt. When they wanted to build palaces or finance universities, they sold salt. Medieval Polish civilization, in a very literal sense, was built on salt, while Europe built its empires on this mineral. Across the Atlantic Ocean, civilizations that had never had contact with Europe developed exactly the same understanding of the value of salt. The Mayans in the Yucatan Peninsula organized extremely complex trade networks based largely on the exchange of salt. The coastal saltworks of what is today Belize produced salt that traveled inland to the most important urban centers of the Mayan civilization, and that salt was not only exchanged as food, it was used as currency. In the murals of Calakmul, in the state of Campeche, painted more than 2,500 years ago, there are representations of Mayan markets where merchants exchange blocks of salt with the same normalcy with which we use banknotes today. The Aztecs also knew the power of salt and also used it in their transactions. In Tibet, thousands of meters high, pressed blocks of salt circulated as money. In Central Africa, caravans crossing the Sahara transported salt from the northern mines to the southern kingdoms. And in those transactions, a sack of salt was worth as much as a sack of gold. Salt was not a condiment in medieval sub-Saharan Africa. It was the reference currency of an entire continent. That power of salt in Africa explains something that very few people associate with this mineral, but which marked one of the darkest periods in human history. The salt trade routes in the Sahara and West Africa were intimately connected with the human trade routes. The same caravans that transported salt to the south transported captured people to the north. Salt was so valuable and so necessary that the kingdoms that controlled it could exchange it for anything. And among the things exchanged in those markets were human beings. The salt economy fed for centuries trade networks that drained entire populations of sub-Saharan Africa, not in the same way or with the same dimensions as the Atlantic slave trade that would come later, but with the same ruthless logic. Salt was so valuable that whoever had it could get anything else with it. In Europe, meanwhile, salt accumulated a political power that would finally explode in the most dramatic way. The most illustrative case is that of France, where a tax on salt called the gabelle became one of the most hated symbols of monarchical absolutism. The gabelle was not a simple tax. It was a system of economic control and extraction of a complexity and cruelty that is hard to believe. First, the state was the only seller of salt. No one could produce or sell it on their own. Second, prices varied arbitrarily depending on the region. The same amount of salt cost 10 times more in Normandy than in Languedoc, and that difference did not respond to any logic of transport or production, but purely and simply to the decision of the royal tax collectors. Third, and this is what made the gabelle truly oppressive. In many regions of France, the purchase of a minimum amount of salt was mandatory. Citizens could not decide to buy less salt than they needed. they had to buy it in the amount that the state fixed, at the price that the state imposed, from the seller that the state designated, and if someone was discovered collecting salt from the sea on their own, or buying it as contraband at lower prices, the penalty could reach the gallows. In the 10th century, France executed more people for crimes related to salt than for almost any other crime. The kingdom's prisons were full of salt smugglers, and the resentment that this system generated in the population accumulated for generations, layer upon layer, year after year, until in 1789, when the harvests failed and hunger spread through the French countryside, that resentment found its outlet. The French Revolution had many causes. Salt was one of the most important and one of the least remembered. The same logic that the French monarchy used to oppress its people was adopted shamelessly by European colonial empires when they expanded around the world, and no case illustrates this more clearly than that of India under British rule. For centuries, the inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent had produced salt freely. It was something that anyone could do near the coast. Evaporate seawater and collect the crystals, an activity so basic, so ancien, and so widespread that no one had ever thought to regulate it. The British regulated it. When the British Empire consolidated its control over India, one of the first things it did was ban the private production of salt. No one could collect salt from the sea. No one could produce it at home. Only the colonial government could produce it. And all the inhabitants of India, including the poorest of the poor, were forced to buy it from the colonial government at the prices the colonial government set. For Indian peasants living on a few pennies a day, the salt tax was a brutal burden. For the millions of laborers who sweated in the fields under the blazing sun and needed salt simply to maintain the balance of their bodies, that tax was a form of institutionalized extortion. And it was on this tax that a thin, 60-year-old man, dressed in a simple white cloth and leaning on a bamboo cane, decided to build the greatest civil disobedience action of the 20th century. On March 12, 1930, Mahatma Gandhi left his ashram in Ahmedabad. Accompanied by 78 followers, he started walking. In the first few days, the march was a small group passing through dusty villages, but as they walked, something happened. People came out of their houses to watch them pass, and then came out to join. In every village they crossed, men and women left what they were doing and joined the column. By the time the march reached the coast, after 24 days and 300 kilometers of walking, it was a crowd of thousands of people. On April 6, 1930, Gandhi advanced towards the Indian Ocean, bent down, and gathered a handful of wet salt from the shore in his hands. With that gesture, he declared to the most powerful British Empire in the world that the salt of the sea belonged to those who lived by the sea, and that no human law could change that. The British arrested 60,000 people in the following months for illegally collecting or selling salt. Gandhi himself spent 9 months in prison. But the image of that old man bending over the water to take salt with his hands had gone around the world, and the empire never again had the same moral authority over India. 15 years later, India was independent. The history of salt and the history of the freedom of 1 billion people had crossed on a beach. While these great political dramas were unfolding in Asia and Europe, salt continued to fulfill its most silent and fundamental function, which was to make it possible for human populations to feed themselves during the months when nature did not provide. That function was especially critical in Northern Europe and in mountainous areas where the winter was long and fresh food disappeared for months. Salted cod, that dry white fish that appears today in Mediterranean kitchens as a cultural tradition, was for centuries the protein that kept entire populations of Europe alive. The fishing fleets that worked the banks of Newfoundland and Iceland brought in immense catches that would have been completely useless without salt. Every fishing boat carried tons of salt, because without it, The fish caught in the cold waters of the North Atlantic would have started to rot before reaching port. With it, the fish could reach Lisbon, Seville, Marseille, Genoa, perfectly preserved and available to feed cities that were weeks of navigation away from where it had been caught. The great maritime powers of Europe, Portugal, Spain, England, the Netherlands competed fiercely for access to the salt flats. Because their commercial empires, based on maritime trade, depended on salt as much as on ships and sails. The discovery and colonization of America added new dimensions to that competition. European colonizers needed salt not only to feed themselves during the Atlantic crossing, but to preserve the meat and products they sent back to Europe and to supply the populations they were establishing in the New World. The natural salt flats of America became a strategic objective from the early years of colonization. When European powers competed for American territory, one of the questions that was always present was, who would have access to the salt sources? In the American War of Independence, control of the salt flats was a military factor of primary importance. George Washington's Continental Army constantly suffered from a shortage of salt. Without it, he could not preserve meat to feed his troops. The official history of American independence speaks of rifles and strategy and leadership. It speaks less of the desperate search for salt that occupied the Army's quartermasters for years, and of how the scarcity of this mineral threatened on several occasions to paralyze the military campaign before it ended. In the 19th century, two phenomena forever transformed humanity's relationship with salt. The first was industrialization, which turned salt from a handcrafted product into a mass industrial product. Extraction techniques improved to the point that what previously required the work of thousands of people for months could be done in weeks with machinery. Railways allowed salt to be transported from the mines to the ports, and from the ports to the interior of the continents at a speed and cost impossible to imagine in previous eras, and the accumulation of all these advances did something that no one would have predicted centuries before. It made salt cheap. For the first time in documented history, salt ceased to be a scarce commodity. It became something that anyone could buy without it posing a significant economic burden. The second phenomenon was the discovery of new industrial uses for salt that multiplied its demand beyond anything related to food. 19th century chemistry discovered that sodium chloride, which is what salt is, was the perfect raw material to manufacture chlorine, caustic soda, and a series of compounds that were essential for the textile industry, for glass manufacturing, for soap production, and for dozens of other manufacturing processes. Salt was no longer just food, it was industry, and that industrial demand skyrocketed production to levels that would have been unimaginable to any inhabitant of the previous world. The salt mines of Poland, Germany, England, and North America expanded to become operations that extracted millions of tons a year, and the price of salt fell until it became almost insignificant. That drop in price was a silent revolution, but with immense consequences. For millennia, the control of salt had been one of the main levers of political power. States that monopolized salt had a perfect mechanism for tax collection and social control. When salt became cheap and abundant, that mechanism disappeared. Governments that had built entire systems of taxes and monopolies on salt suddenly found that this resource was no longer worth enough to justify the bureaucratic and police apparatus. It would have required the French gabelle, which had been one of the pillars of the old regime's tax system, was definitively abolished. The salt monopolies that the colonial empires had maintained in Asia and Africa began to crumble, although in some cases, like that of British India, they took decades longer to fall. The democratization of salt was, in a very real sense, a democratization of power. But while salt became cheap and available to everyone, something unexpected began to happen at the other end of history. The problem was no longer that people could not get salt. The problem was that people consumed too much. For thousands of years, the human body had evolved in an environment where salt was scarce and valuable, and therefore, the body had developed very efficient mechanisms to retain it and a very intense appetite for salty flavors. Those mechanisms were perfect for a world where getting salt required effort and money. They were completely inadequate for a world where salt was so cheap that it was added to practically all the processed foods that the food industry produced. The 20th century food industry quickly discovered that salt not only preserved food, but made it more palatable, masked the metallic taste of some chemical preservatives, improved the texture of processed products, and ultimately made people buy more. And it added salt to everything, to bread, to breakfast cereals, to canned soups, to bottled sauces, to cold cuts, to processed cheeses, to savory crackers, and to sweet ones. By the mid-20th century, doctors began to notice a worrying correlation between high salt consumption and high blood pressure, which in turn was linked to heart attacks and strokes. Research accumulated over decades. The relationship between excess sodium in the diet and cardiovascular disease became increasingly clear. Today, medical science has enough evidence to confidently state that excessive salt consumption is one of the most important risk factors for heart disease, the leading cause of death in the world. The World Health Organization recommends that adults consume less than 5 grams of salt per day. Most of the population in industrialized countries consumes double or triple that amount, and most of that salt does not come from the salt shaker on the table. It comes from processed foods, where it is so integrated that the average consumer does not notice it and cannot control it. And here history takes one of its darkest turns. Because what happened with salt in the 20th century bears an uncomfortable resemblance to what had happened with salt in previous centuries. In the past, those who controlled salt controlled populations through monopoly and taxation. In the present, the food industry controls the salt consumption of populations through the massive addition of this mineral to processed foods, and it does so knowing perfectly well that this excessive consumption has consequences for health. Research on the negative effects of excess sodium has been known for decades, and yet the industry has invested for years in financing studies that cast doubt on that relationship, in lobbying regulatory bodies to prevent stricter limits on salt content in processed foods from being imposed, and in designing communication strategies that divert attention from sodium to other nutrients, the mineral that the pharaohs used to preserve their dead, that Chinese emperors turned into a state monopoly, that French kings used to oppress their peasants, remains an instrument of power today. Only now the power is not political, but economic, and it is not exercised through the sword, but through the labeling of processed foods. World salt production today exceeds 280 million tons a year. China is the largest producer in the world, followed by the United States. Barely 17% of that production goes to human nutrition. The rest is used in the chemical industry, in treating roads to remove ice in winter, in manufacturing plastics, and in dozens of other industrial processes. Salt is today the most extracted mineral on the planet by volume, and yet its price is so low that people rarely think of it as something that has economic value. It is everywhere and seems to cost nothing. But that normality is completely new. For 10,000 years of documented human history, salt was scarce, expensive, politically explosive, and socially determining. Entire civilizations were organized around it. Empires were financed by it. Revolutions broke out over it. Millions of people worked in extremely harsh conditions to extract, transport, and sell it. Men and women were executed for stealing it from the state. An old man walked 300 kilometers under the Indian sun to pick up a handful of it from the seashore. And with that gesture, he started the countdown of an empire. Salt was never a simple condiment. It was the mineral that made civilization as we know it possible. Because without the ability to preserve food that salt provided, there was no way to store surpluses. And without surpluses, there was no trade. And without trade, there were no cities. And without cities, there was no civilization. Everything we call history today, art and architecture, politics and philosophy, science and literature grew on a material base that included, in an absolutely fundamental way, the ability to salt a piece of meat and save it for the winter. The next time you pick up the salt shaker and shake it over your food without thinking, without measuring, without the slightest sense that it matters. Remember that this automatic and inconsequential gesture you perform in 2 seconds is the result of 10 millennia of history. Remember that there is a Roman building that today is called the Via Salaria, buried under the streets of Italy, because an army needed to transport that same mineral that you just mindlessly tossed onto your plate. Remember that there are mummies that have been perfectly preserved for 3,000 years in museums because someone discovered what that mineral could do to organic matter. Remember that there is a man who walked for almost a month under the scorching sun of the Indian subcontinent to reach the seashore and collect with his own hands what you have in front of you. Remember that the word with which you describe your income, that salary you receive at the end of the month, was born from that white mineral you hold in your hand. And remember that the men who were hanged in France for taking salt from the sea without paying the king died for exactly the same thing that you just did, without it costing you a second of concern. That is the power of history. And that is the power of salt.